Grazie, thank you. In the course of almost 50 years of translating Shadal's works on the Chumash, I have gained insights into some of the lesser known aspects of Shadal's life and career. I would like to share some of these with you now. I did not prepare any visual aids, but I have two sheets of paper that maybe I can distribute to the audience at some point as I'm speaking. I just want to first say that I would not be here today if it were not for two very special people in my life. My father, Sidney Klein, alav hashalom, who challenged me to learn a new language and subtly steered me toward Italian. My grandmother, Elizabeth Isaacs Gilbert, aleha hashalom, introduced me to Shadal when she showed me and ultimately gave me the original edition of the Pentateuch that had been in her father's possession. I would therefore like to dedicate my presentation L'zecher Nishmot Simcha Binyamin ben Elazar HaKohen and Dobrish bat Harav Hillel HaKohen. In one of Shadal's letters to Rav Ben Amozeg, he makes an interesting remark. He says, "Polemics with Christianity have never stirred my blood. If someone came to attack me, I would respond, the swords still exist. They have not yet been turned into plowshares. So no one has come. But be a good Christian, I say, and let everyone be faithful to their native beliefs. It was in this sense that I often spoke with Monsignor Nardi when he was a professor here, and we lived for many years in good harmony." Now, who was this Monsignor Nardi? My research revealed that first of all, Monsignor is a title used by a Catholic clergyman who has received certain papal honors. And Francesco Nardi, whose dates were 1808 to 1877, was a professor of canon law, in other words, Catholic religious law, at the University of Padua. An obituary described him as one of the most indefatigable, earnest, and even violent defenders of the cause of the Pope. But it went on to observe that no difference in political opinions, even the most diametrically opposite, ever interfered with the affection and esteem for those whom he had once reckoned among his old friends. I also found out that this man had also almost been made a cardinal, but he died just before this could have happened. Now, how did he become acquainted with Shadal? In 1839, Nardi wrote a short work on the history of embroidery, of all things, and he apparently reached out to Shadal to seek his assistance in explaining the biblical term rokem. And in his work, which is online, Nardi not only acknowledges Shadal's help, but calls him ornamento della nostra città, an ornament of our city. From that time until about 1859, when Nardi moved to Rome, Shadal and Nardi occasionally exchanged letters, perhaps even personal visits, concerning biblical Hebrew and other Semitic languages, and we have records of this as preserved in the Epistolario. It's a shame that Frederic Dantonel could not be here today to talk about the Epistolario, the collection of letters by Shadal, mostly in Italian, but also some French, some Latin. It's an amazing resource, which I will refer to more. In an 1850 letter, Shadal expressed a certain criticism of his friend Nardi. He didn't hesitate to disagree with him on a point of Christian religious doctrine. And Shadal said, "One's eternal health cannot depend on the acceptance of incomprehensible dogmas. God can indeed demand of us the sacrifice of our passions, but never that of our sound reason. This, reduced to the most basic terms, is the Jewish-Christian question." And you might think that such a frank remark by a Jewish person to a Catholic priest might spell the end of their friendship, but it did not. Because 7 years later, another letter from Shadal to Nardi opens with the salutation, "Chiarissimo professore, amico carissimo," most distinguished professor, dearest friend, followed by a discussion of 14th chapter of Beishit and certain Hebrew and Arabic place names relating to the Dead Sea. Shadal closes this letter with, Dile devotissimo amico, your most devoted friend. Now, we need to take a minute to consider how remarkable and unlikely this friendship was. At the time in question, the relations between the Roman Catholic Church, especially in Italy, and the Jews could hardly be described as friendly. We heard a description of Nardi as a violent defender of the Pope. The Pope in question was Pius IX, who, among other things, was a key figure in the Mortara affair of 1858. You probably know what that was about, the kidnapping of a Jewish child who had been secretly baptized. The Pope Pius IX himself took personal charge of this kidnapped child and never released him again. So the whole concept of such a close friendship between such a person as Shadal and such a person as Monsignor Nardi is unlikely and rather remarkable. But the story becomes even more remarkable because, as it turns out, Nardi was not Shadal's only prominent non-Jewish friend. In fact, it was through the combined efforts of 4 of these friends that Shadal received one of his highest academic honors from the secular world. And we know about this in most detail from a letter that Shadal wrote to his son Ishaya in July of 1847, in which he proudly announces to his son that Isaiah's papa has been named as a member of the Istituto Veneto. What was this? This was a learned society in the city of Venice. It had been initiated by Napoleon in 1810 during his rule over the city of Venice. It had been refounded in 1838 during the Austrian occupation of Venice. The refounder was the Austrian Emperor Ferdinand I, at which time the society became known as the Royal and Imperial Venetian Institute of Sciences, Letters, and Arts. And without those adjectives, royal and imperial, this Istituto is still active today. I just like to make a side point. We need to keep in mind that throughout Shadal's adult lifetime, both Venice and Padua, where he was working, were part of the Austrian Empire, never an independent Italy. The Collegio Rabbinico itself was under the supervision of the Austrian government. So, Shadal goes on to explain to his son how it was that he was inducted into this society. He says, Iapelli nominated me, Carrere and Cittadella applauded and said many good things about me, and the others approved. Now, Shadal mentions these names casually, as if he expects his son to know who they were. You have to understand, his son was 11 at the time. This leads me to believe that these people might have been spoken of often in the Luzzatto household. Perhaps they were even visitors. Who were they? Shadal did not explain in his letter. I researched their identities. Giuseppe Iapelli was a neoclassical architect and engineer of Venice. Luigi Carrere, also of Venice, was a journalist, a poet, and an editor. Giovanni Cittadella of the city of Padua was a count, a historian, and a literary figure who was later president of the Istituto and later became a senator of the Kingdom of Italy. Then, Shadal specifies that the real impetus behind his nomination was actually from a 4th friend, who he identifies as Poli. And he says that Poli wrote to the Istituto saying, I hope the Istituto will not make the mistake of forgetting any longer this distinguished specialty of our country. Who was he? Baldassare Poli was from Cremona. He was a noted philosopher. He was an instructor at the University of Padua and was also later a president of the Istituto. Now, I have pictures of all of these individuals, and I neglected to make a slide of them, but here they are. Nardi, Poli, Cittadella, Iapelli, and Carrere. If you like, I'll come a little closer. Maybe I can pass it around the room.
Fortunately, there are not too many people.
Yeah, well,
Okay. Or unfortunately.
Fortunately or unfortunately.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, we have to ask ourselves how Shadal came to know these figures so well. I have not found any information about most of them, but we do have a pretty good clue as to Poli, the fourth man. I found that Shadal's earliest letter to him that's included in the Epistolario was written in September 1844, 3 years before these incidents, in which Shadal congratulated Poli on a recent article in which he had made a learned refutation of the so-called science of phrenology. Shadal wanted him to know that as far back as the 1100s, ideas that resembled phrenology had been reported as an already known theory by Judah Levita, in other words, Yehuda Halevi, in the Kuzari. And then he says, the love of truth will excuse me if without personal acquaintance with you, I wanted to communicate these things to you. So this apparently was the start of their friendship, which developed to such a degree in the next few years that this is the next thing we hear. In November 1847, Shadal, writing to a third party, reports that his son Philoseno, otherwise known as Ohev Ger, who was 18 years old at the time, had gotten a third in mathematics in school. And everyone thought that was a fair mark for him to receive, but Poli had intervened without any request from Shadal and employed all his eloquence to persuade the math teacher to change it to a second, and it was done. That's how close they were. The friendship continued even many years later, because we have another letter in 1862 in which Shadal writes to Poli to say how relieved he was to hear that Poli was still in good health, that Shadal himself was getting older but still slowly working, and he observes that the forces of progress are discovering and inventing everything but peace and prosperity. And then he says, but let this be said between us sexagenarians, and let us leave to the young people their illusions, their happy dreams. Now, back to the story of the Istituto. Shadal was accepted as a so-called corresponding member, which apparently was one who resided at some distance from Venice and was essentially a guest member. But almost immediately, the Istituto put him to work. And we know the details of this episode from a letter that he wrote to the editor of an Italian Jewish newspaper, the Rivista Israelitica, in November of 1847. In this letter, first, he expresses displeasure at the newspaper's premature notice of his appointment to the Istituto because it hadn't yet been confirmed by the Austrian government. He said, without such confirmation, it means nothing. You should never have said anything about it. Then he says, he had heard that the editor wanted to know about the laminetta, the plate. Shadal says, it's really not worth telling about, but for fear that it might be misreported, I will tell it to you and you can do with it what you wish. And here's the story he told. In September 1847, a marquis from Palermo reported to the Istituto about a copper plate that had been found in Palazzolo, Sicily, that was inscribed in what the marquis thought was cuneiform and archaic Greek. And he didn't actually present this copper plate to the Istituto. All he did was present them with lithographic copies and asked the group to investigate. At this point, a commission was formed consisting of 6 members. The first 4 were Professor Neumann of Munich, Canon Trevisenato of Venice, Count Miniscalchi of Verona, and Rabbi Lattes. And we have to, he does not go into any detail about who these people were. I had to research that myself. First, Karl Friedrich Neumann was professor of Armenian and Chinese at the University of Munich. Giuseppe Luigi Trevisenato was an instructor of Greek and Oriental languages at the Patriarchal Seminary of Venice. Later, he himself served as the Patriarch of Venice, in other words, the Archbishop, and was made a Roman Catholic cardinal. Count Francesco Miniscalchi Arizzo was a geographer, a linguist, and a traveler in the Middle East. So these first 3 people were very leading citizens of Venice. None of them were Jewish. None of them had any particular expertise in Hebrew. And as we will see, they played a secondary role in the work of this commission. Then we come to the last 3. Avram Lattes, who was chief rabbi of Venice, had been so since 1839. He himself was a former student of Shadal at the Collegio Rabbinico. I was wondering when I first read this whether he was the first Jewish member of the Istituto. I got the answer by directly communicating with the Istituto. They sent me a very polite reply. They said the first Jewish member that they are aware of the Istituto was Jacinto Namias, who was appointed in 1846, just a year before. He was a physician who studied the mechanism of the human voice. So he was accepted as a member because of his scientific credentials. My guess is that Rabbi Lattes perhaps was the second Jewish member and the first one accepted because of his Jewish scholarship, and then came Shadal, who was apparently the third. And then rounding out the 6 members of the commission was Professor Luzzatto himself, as he referred to himself, and guess who? Monsignor Nardi. So then Shadal goes on to explain, some commission members quickly realized that there was no cuneiform on this plate, no ancient Greek. It was Shadal himself who figured out that instead there was so-called angelic writing typical of Hebrew kameot or amulets. He doesn't explain what this angelic writing was. I had to look that up. The so-called angelic variety of the Aleph Bet was published and possibly invented in the 16th century by a Christian scholar of the occult who had the remarkable name of Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa von Nettesheim. I will show you also a picture of the angelic writing, which I found. Here we are. As you can see, each letter has a name corresponding to Aleph Bet, but it doesn't look anything like the Aleph Bet. To the untrained eye, it could have been cuneiform. And I will pass this around. So, what we can infer from these circumstances, although Shadal does not say so in his letter, we can assume that this copper plate was not made by a Jew and was not really very ancient, because by the time this so-called angelic Aleph Bet was published or invented, there were no longer any Jews in Sicily. The Jewish communities that had flourished there once in the Middle Ages had been expelled in 1493 when the Spanish Inquisition reached the island. Shadal goes on to explain what the process was that they were following. He was still having difficulty reading this text. Apparently it was a very bad lithographic copy. Even though he was familiar with this alphabet, it was still hard. Then he looked carefully at the written description of the plate that had been given to them, which said, the letters were concave on the side where they had been stamped, but convex on the reverse. The letters in the lithographic copy had been taken from the convex side. In other words, they had been trying to read the wrong side of the paper copy. They had to turn it over and read the reverse. And that way, Shadal was able to make out the words Amen Selah. And then he and Rabbi Lattes and Monsignor Nardi found other Hebrew and Aramaic words indicating that the plate was in fact a kamea. The writing or its reproduction was so poor and hard to read that the commission did not find it necessary to decipher the whole thing. They just left well enough alone, at which point a report was submitted to the Istituto. Nardi wrote the report, in which he said, among other things, the honor of the felicitous idea that the plate was a Hebrew amulet is due to the illustre mio amico, my illustrious friend, Professor Luzzatto. Shadal reports, the report was read to great applause, and no one had the least objection to Shadal's proposed interpretation. So that's all we know about this incident. I have several conclusions that we can draw from what happened here. First, Shadal's impact on his time and place was broader than we usually think. Second, Shadal was able to maintain friendly relations with people despite significant religious and cultural differences between them. Third, as a subject of the Austrian Empire, Shadal was able to achieve prestige and academic respect outside the Jewish world, even though his entire career was spent within the Jewish community and even before full Jewish emancipation. You have to wonder where else in the world in 1847 such an incident could have happened. Not in the United States, even though the Jews were fairly free there, but because there was no Jewish scholar of Shadal's caliber in America at that time. Could not have happened in Germany, could not have happened in Russia, any of the other Jewish population centers. This was an astonishing thing that happened. You also have to remember that the civil and political equality was granted by the Kingdom of Italy to the Jews of Venice and Padua in 1866, the year after Shadal died. And if those cities had remained under Austrian control, the Jews would have had to wait one more year to be fully emancipated. Never happened during Shadal's lifetime. And yet, he was accorded the great honor and respect that he was under the Austrian rule in his time. The final point I would like to make, and this reinforces what we heard from Professor Sella, without consulting the Epistolario and other Italian sources, our picture of Shadal and his character and career must remain incomplete. These are very valuable resources that must be looked to get a full picture of who Shadal was and what he did. So again, grazie, thank you very much, and toda raba.